Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast, where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you are up this week.
Yes.
What are you bringing to the table today?
Well, I'm really excited to be bringing the partner article to the one that we read last week.
Yes, my homework.
Yes. Taking advantage of your homework. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That article was called June Jordan on Palestine and American Delusions. And like the partner article was published in These Times magazine and also features an introduction that was written by Sherell Barbee. And after that introduction by Barbee, there are excerpts from two of June Jordan's essays, which were both incredible. The first essay is called Life After Lebanon from 1984. And in that essay, June Jordan basically shares her reflections on Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and her experience with backlash for publicly condemning that invasion and her deep appreciation for the women who supported her through all of that. And then the second essay is called Waking Up in the Middle of Some American Dreams, which is from 1986. And in that one, June Jordan stresses and analyzes the pressing need for and the power of coalition building, particularly, I think, for our democracy and certainly for our collective liberation. So, just like last week's piece, this was a really insightful and powerful article, particularly and especially June Jordan's essays. They were really powerful essays, to say the least, and they were just the excerpts of them, right? And so I'm particularly excited to talk about them. I also appreciated Sherell Barbee's reflections on June Jordan's work, particularly when she said, quote, "In spite of the attempts to silence Jordan, her work continues to serve as a blueprint for Black queer feminism rooted in unwavering solidarity with Palestine." And that alone got me very excited to, read these essays and find out what more I could learn from them all of these years later. I mean, these are pieces from 1986, but in many ways, and maybe this is a spoiler for what we'll talk about later, but, there's a lot of relevance with these pieces to what we're experiencing today. So, let's get in. I'm excited to hear and talk about what we both learned from these pieces. Where do you want to start, my friend?
Yeah, I mean, to be expected. This was another fantastic couple of essays, and I'm grateful that In These Times brought them to our attention again through republishing them in this manner and introducing us to this work. One of the things I thought about this week, especially in the context of having just read the Toni Morrison essays last week, is that the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
As you just alluded to
Absolutely.
as well. That we're sort of in the same place as we were in 1982 as Israel attacks densely populated residential areas in Beirut today.
Yes.
And at the same time, they've been bombing Gaza without restraint over the last year.
Seriously, yes.
And there has been a lot of backlash against people who have spoken out against this, similarly to the way that June Jordan talks about in her Life After Lebanon essay. But I do think that some things have shifted because we have social media, which has empowered more folks to share what's actually happening.
It's true.
And subverts some of the narrative making in the West about Israel defending itself. And I think there are more ways to connect with other people who are speaking out against it.
Absolutely.
In ways that weren't available
certainly
even just a few years ago.
Yeah.
And so there's ways to see that I'm not alone and I'm not a crazy person for thinking the way that I think about this.
Right.
But there still is backlash, and we've seen it just recently with Ta-Nehisi Coates and his appearance on CBS and the line of questioning he faced during that interview, which was just wild.
Yeah.
But back to June Jordan's essays, she talks about how these taboo topics get structured to be taboo and who's allowed to speak on what and what it is they're allowed to say.
Yes.
And I just thought she had a really powerful description of the ways that fear shapes what's acceptable to talk about and how that fear is developed and how that shapes who can say what and when they're allowed to say it and where they're allowed to say it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I thought about that too. And one of the things that you said that also I just wanted to mention briefly is the power and the presence of social media and the impact that that's had. I mean, I think that's a really powerful difference in what we experienced collectively in the 80s versus now, and what that has done to bring us together, but also to shine a light on and illuminate what's going on. And I also appreciate your thought around it connecting us in a way to make us feel less crazy, and to make us feel like there are others who share our viewpoints about the atrocities, the genocide. And so I think that's a powerful point. But yeah, I mean, I think in so many ways in the Life After Lebanon essay, it was so powerful because she really pulls no punches and sort of talks about what, her reflections on what was going on in such a direct and powerful and pointed way. She talked about the power of women, and especially women supporting each other. She talked about the negative impacts of censorship. She talked about the dangers of speaking out against authoritarianism and state-sanctioned and state-funded violence against Palestinians and Arabs. And she talked so beautifully also about her worries about what would become of Lebanon and Palestine in the future. And again, it's all just so wild to think about that this is from the early 80s, mid 80s, and it's still so relevant today. And to your point, especially her thoughts around who gets to have opinions, right? And who gets to speak out on those opinions. And so there's this piece of her analysis that I pulled because it was really powerful. She says, quote, "Now it is one thing to disagree and quite another to prohibit disagreement. The invasion of Lebanon erected a subject off limits to disagreement. The only supposedly legitimate persons allowed by the media to express any views whatsoever on Lebanon, Israel, Palestinians, U.S. Middle East policies were white men. Everyone else was either an Arab, i.e. anti-Semitic, or else self-hating Jews, i.e. anti-Semitic. With the construction of an ultimate taboo, a taboo behind which the fate of an entire people, the Palestinians, might be erased, how could there be an intellectual, a moral life after Lebanon in this country? I would have to answer my own question in this way, because many people in the United States and around the globe are not now, nor have they ever been, white men." And I mean, I really appreciate that analysis. And we've talked about this before, but authoritarian leaders don't want people speaking out against their efforts, against the status quo. And more often than not, I think throughout history, we've seen that the folks who do this the most are folks of color, are folks who hold marginalized identities. And those folks, as June Jordan points out, are deemed not legitimately qualified to speak out against them. And that to me just feels so relevant to what we're experiencing today.
Yeah, and I pulled a bit from the section just before where you quoted.
Yep.
And she says, quote, "In addition, I learned as a result of a poem I wrote that was published in July 1982 in the Village Voice. And I learned as a result of all of the op-ed pieces of mine that the New York Times unabashedly refused to print, that no women, and certainly no non-white woman, should presume to think about, form an opinion, construct an analysis of any issue of conflict between white men. Either the white men in this country will censor and block the publication of such a woman's thoughts, or they will whitelist and pounce upon her with such epithets as anti-Semitic and naive and divisive." And I think that sets up in a lot of ways the point you just made, where she makes the point very clearly, right? What you just said. But I want to highlight a couple things here that I think helps build out how I understood what her essay is. She talks about the way only certain folks are allowed to weigh in on issues. The conflicts between white men are only to be discussed amongst other white men. Thus, usually leaving out the people who are actually impacted by these conflicts between white men and most of the rest of the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So she makes a fantastic point here that you either don't get published, and thereby you're not allowed to participate in the discussion, or you do get published and then you have your character assassinated because you weighed in and you don't fit the description of who should be weighing in.
You didn't have a right to.
Yeah. You fit into one of the categories you mentioned of being, anti-Semitic basically in
Right.
different ways.
Right.
So, and that just reinforces the taboo and the fear around who is allowed to speak up and who's allowed to speak up about what. And the other thing she does here throughout this essay is she writes white men as a single word.
Yes, you noticed that too.
Yes, which I think the way I interpreted that is I think it denotes a particular structural power that she's talking about here. It's not about white men as a group, but the white men who are sitting in the seats of power around the world.
Yes.
And probably those who see themselves more aligned with those men in the seats of power, who believe that they are more connected with those people in the seats of power than they are with the rest of us regular folks.
Yes.
And these are the men she's talking about who hold people back from discussion, or who call you names when you do participate, and or say that what you wrote could be in the backpack of an extremist. And I love that stylistic choice because it's talking about a set of behaviors that aligns itself with the white supremacist structures.
Yes.
It's not talking about people or individuals. It's talking about the ways that individuals bring these structures to life interpersonally, and even not interpersonally, but bigger than interpersonally as well.
Yeah, and reinforce it,
Yes.
right? Yeah, I very much so picked up on her use of white men as a singular word, and also white men as lowercase single word. And I had a lot of thoughts about that, and I think you really described them so brilliantly there. And I think the I came at it initially as it's a jab, like go ahead, June Jordan, it's a jab. But I think it was a lot more than that.
Yeah.
All of the ways you described.
It's a jab at the structure, right?
Yes.
She's criticizing the structural powers of it. And I think that's an important point to make too, is that it is a jab.
Yes.
And it's because there's making it one word, not having any kind of capital letters in it. That's all a message too.
Absolutely.
But she's talking about the set of powers, right? And that's how she's talking about the privileges that come with it. She's talking about the hierarchical power that is established through white supremacy.
Absolutely. And the ways in which that shows up in places like our media, right? In the context of what was it, the New York Times?
Yeah.
Which again, I appreciate her so much for naming the institutions directly, right? You have to do that. So that's great. I'm glad you talked about that a little bit. We should also talk about her other incredible essay, Waking Up in the Middle of Some American Dreams. One of the biggest pieces of wisdom and takeaways from that essay to me was how it emphasized why our collective liberation is tied to one another, how we are inextricably linked in and by our struggles. And to me, that then is the only route to our liberation. So June Jordan says this in this essay. She says, quote, "American delusions of individuality now disfigure our national landscape with multitudes of disconnected, pained human beings who pull down the shades on prolonged and needless agony. But if we would speak the unspeakable, if we would name and say the source of our sorrow and scars, we would find a tender and a powerful company of others struggling as we do. And we would know we should show to the world at last that shame belongs with blame, not on the victim." And I just love those words. I think there's real beauty in those words, but also real power in those words. And, again, I think what she's trying to get us to understand and acknowledge is just how connected we actually are in our struggles and in our day-to-day battles with all of the ills and injustices in our society, right? But also how important it is that we absolutely have to speak up and out against them and against the things that truly harm us all.
Yes. Yeah, that's such a great passage. I highlighted it too, because she goes on to build on that point later by saying, quote, "But each American one of us feels so special and so different that none of us assumes the validity of his or her outrage or longing inside the mythical context of the American mainstream. We become persuaded that the people of our country must be somebody else, not you and me, even as we regard our government as some alien, half-dead, and unaccountable monarch to whom we, sooner or later, must pay homage, or at least taxes." We tolerate insulting, homicidal proposals for national security, such as an aircraft carrier or a helmet and bulletproof vest, when what we know is that national security must mean, for example, respectful and adequate and guaranteed tender care for elderly Americans. And for any American, one of us who cannot by herself do things without help. There's so much in that.
Yes.
But when we fall for these trappings of individualism and we see ourselves as separate, we don't get the things we collectively need.
Yes.
We allow military budgets to grow without restraint because it's easy to see how that supports us as individuals and how that supports our concepts of safety that have been built. But we ignore the collective good when that happens, and we allow politicians to ignore the collective good.
Yes.
And therefore, we again ignore the collective good for the perceived good of the individual.
Absolutely.
And it's such a great passage. So all of that like connects together and builds on lot of what it is that what it is the purpose of that whole essay is.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I love about what you quoted there was the idea of, there's a part in it where she says, not you and me. And it's this idea that what I pulled out from that is what we try to do here on the podcast, but also what we do in our friendship, right? Like this idea that we can talk about these things together, but it's bigger than us. And there are other folks who are affected by what's going on in the world. And, you know, we have to talk about those things and fight against all of those things together.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm spoiling homework, but I want to read these these essays in full. Absolutely. All right, well, let's shift over to the application portion of our show. How does this piece and these essays and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work? I think one of the biggest takeaways from both June Jordan's essays and actually also from Toni Morrison's essays from last week is just how important it is to speak out and to fight. As scary as that might be, as dangerous as that might be, certainly as difficult as that might be, you know, we simply cannot be silent in the face of injustice.
Yeah.
And in June Jordan's Life After Lebanon essay, she shares some really powerful words about this. So I wanted to share it because she says it better than I could. She says, quote, "As a child, I was taught that to tell the truth was often painful. As an adult, I have learned that not to tell the truth is more painful, and that the fear of telling the truth is the most painful sensation of a moral life." You know, that fear is real, and that fear is often at play, but it cannot stop us from doing the work and fighting for our collective liberation. And so I appreciate her words so much. I think about, you know, that quote, and I think about what we try to tell like young people in our lives about the importance of telling the truth, the importance of doing what's right, even when it's difficult. It's all of that, but it's also so much bigger than that when we're talking about the things that we talk about here. So I loved that so much.
Yeah, it's such a great quote from that first essay. And I think because we all have to find the way through the fear of truth telling in our own ways.
Yeah.
We have to find the courage to speak truths about different things, because there's different ways you have to react to the truths that you have to tell. And there's different places you have to tell the truth, and there's different people to whom you have to tell the truth. And all of that influences how you react to it. All the variables change the way that we relate to that, overcoming that fear.
Yes.
And so, it's highlighted that too. So good. My application comes from the end of the Waking Up in the Middle of Some American Dreams essay. June Jordan writes, quote, "But I'm special. I'm different, just like you. I worried about putting together these sentences I have written here from my heart. What was the point? To whom should I present myself? What can I know of the doubts and the aching and the bitterness that may prey upon a middle-class nuclear family living in, for instance, Portland, Oregon? And then I understood that question was rather, do I care? And then I understood that the answer is yes, yes, yes. I care because I want you to care about me. I care because I have become aware of my absolute dependency upon you, whoever you are, for the quality and the outcome of my social, my democratic experience.
Yes.
One of the reasons why we call this podcast of ours Interdependent Study is because when you realize that you want to work for collective liberation, you recognize how interconnected we all are.
Yes.
We're all dependent upon one another for liberation. We have to care about each other, and we have to want to care about each other, both in the macro way across your city or state or country or hemisphere or globe, what have you, but also in the micro way, the interpersonal. We have to look out for one another and care.
Yes.
And however that shows up for us in those spaces. But both the vision for liberation we have for the future, but also we make liberation for our communities as we navigate the systems that currently exist.
Oh, wow. Yes.
And so we have to shape that along the way to the big vision. And I think it's such a beautiful point that she makes as she closes out, at least the excerpt. I don't know if this is actually the end of this.
Right. That would be fascinating to see. Yeah.
But I care because I want you to care about me.
Yeah.
And that's why I wrote this.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a beautiful sentiment, and it's a way to capture what you talked about earlier, but the whole idea around us being our liberation is connected. That's why it's collective liberation.
Yes.
None of us are free until all of us are free.
Absolutely. Well, and there's something so vulnerable in that passage about, and it's just, it's a stylistic choice, but it's probably also just the way in which she writes of asking these questions, right? To whom do I present myself? What is the point? And then she gets to this place, do I care? Yes, I do care, right? And I love the journey she took us on there.
Yeah.
And I especially love and appreciate your connection to why we call this podcast Interdependent Study, why we believe in what we believe in. And, she articulated that so very well. So, okay, application was spot on this evening. I love it.
All around.
Let's talk about homework. What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work when we leave the table today? I absolutely want to read these essays. Last week I talked about wanting to read more of Toni Morrison's work and books, and I think it makes sense to just add June Jordan's work to that list as well.
Yeah.
And beyond these essays, but also including reading the full versions of these essays as well, just to see what we missed and what more we can learn from them. So we've got a lot that we've added to our reading list over the past 2 weeks, which I'm very excited about. What about you?
Yeah, agreed. I want to read more of June Jordan's work. There is a poem that opens up this article very beautifully. And the first few lines of it are, I said I love you and I wanted genocide to stop. I said I loved you and I wanted nobody thirst and nobody cold. I said I loved you and I wanted justice under my nose. And so that's from a poem called Intifada Incantation, poem number 8 for BBL. So it was a powerful way to open up the description, the introduction to these two essays, the excerpts of these two essays. So, and reading the two essays, they felt poetic in a lot of ways that sometimes the things that we read here aren't necessarily. Yeah. And I felt that way last week too with Toni Morrison's. It was very literary, and sometimes the stuff we read is more, I don't know, it's not as literary. Yeah. Which I haven't fully unpacked what I actually mean by that, but hopefully that is understood.
Yes.
So I want to read more June Jordan too, more Toni Morrison. So let's figure out ways to incorporate more folks, more literature maybe in the show.
I love that idea. Yeah. Let's do it. Very good. All right. Well, that's all we've got about this incredible piece and these essays. And you're up next time, my friend. Yeah. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing our October book to the table.
Wow.
It's still October, right?
Yes, it is.
All right, great. It's called White Property, Black Trespass, Racial Capitalism, and the Religious Function of Mass Incarceration. It's written by Andrew Crinks and was published a few months ago in August. And it really dives into how religion shaped the creation of white supremacy. I think we have always talked about, or as I've learned more and more about white supremacy over the years and its culture and development and the history of it, I've always thought of it as a key way that reinscribed what white supremacy is. Mm-hmm. But I feel like the way that he's laid this out is that it's not that religion is a beam in the structure of white supremacy, but it's a cornerstone. It is foundational. And it's been a truly fascinating read thus far as he weaves together that history of founding of white supremacy and the development of white supremacy into all of the different projects of white supremacy in the United States. And there's a lot of great background and history, as you might be able to tell from me talking about it. And I knew some of this, but this book goes into some detail that is great and gives these histories some new shape for me and how I understand them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the what do you call that? The piece of the title of a book after the colon.
The subtitle?
The subtitle. Thank you. We're recording late again and my brain is struggling to keep up. It's racial capitalism and the religious function of mass incarceration. And I just don't think I have thought very deeply or analytically about the religious function of mass incarceration, the religious function of white supremacy, how religion has been a catalyst for some of what we've seen and what we're experiencing in the white supremacist projects, as you name them. And so, it's been a fascinating read so far. I'm almost done. And it's a big book. There's a lot in it. I don't know how we're going to get it done or talk about it in one episode. It might be doing a little injustice there, but I'm really excited to talk about all that we're learning from it. So, absolutely. Definitely. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out over on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.